Good evening. Was it just a tragic suicide, or was it a murder that's being covered up?
Why would the government of the United States torture and murder your brother and did not do anything about it, cover it up?
It's about a death in federal custody and a family left with a lot of unanswered questions.
Right. He's prepared for burial for an open casket type
Open casket. They stripped him. They took all the makeup off and he was beaten to a pulp.
Brett Jordan, the state's chief medical examiner, speaks out in anger about the mysterious death of Kenneth Michael Trentadue.
And I had no explanation. Could not fathom why that would happen. Now I know it was to conceal a bigger, uglier picture involving the DOJ and the FBI.
As he leaves the Noble County Courthouse in Perry, Oklahoma, a first look at Timothy McVeigh, the first suspect arrested in the deadly bombing in Oklahoma City.
Just before he was executed, McVeigh got a hold of me, sent me a message, and he said, when I saw your brother's picture and what I'd done to him, and I want you to know that I believe the FBI killed him because they thought he was Richard Lee Guthrie.
All right, we are joined today by Jesse Trentadue, and Jesse has a horrible, tragic story, but has been, I feel, a hero in helping try to uncover, most importantly to him, what happened with his brother, who was killed in 1995, but ultimately the Oklahoma City bombing. How are you doing today, Jesse?
Well, I'm doing good, and I appreciate this opportunity. I'm almost 80, and this may be one of the last chances I have to tell the story.
Well, I so hope that I can do my part to help get the story out there. I feel like it's been long enough. We're arguing over things at this point in time, like the JFK files are finally starting to come out in a decent manner. MLK. There's a lot of things that have gone on, and it's time. It's time. And I am hoping that this interview and the other interviews I'm doing covering this will help to encourage a more forthright response or complete response to things like surveillance footage and items of that sort. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me about all this. I just want to start out, early on though. Can you tell me about Ken?
Well, I guess to understand this story, you have to understand us as a family. We're from the Cumberland Mountains, a place called Number 7 Holler, a Southern Appalachian coal camp. Have you heard of the Cumberland Mountains?
Well, I had family that lived in Rose Hill, which is right near Cumberland Gap. So I'm assuming that's where you're speaking of.
You're getting close. You're getting into deliverance country.
Okay. Well, and I thought the show Justified was kind of Harlan County. Is that nearby that area?
That's the Cumberland Mountains. Mountain people.
Okay.
We had the good fortune, and I know this is going to sound strange to your audience, to grow up poor with a loving family and a supporting community. And that's our people had lived in those mountains since the 1500s. And when I was growing up, people like my great grandmothers sometimes never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. We made our own soap, homemade quilts, outhouses. There was no such thing as a living room. There's always a bed in every room in the house because it was a company house. But you go up close with family and community. Our stories are very much a story of kin and place. And things were going bad in the 50s in the coal fields, and my parents picked up and moved to what they call the Promised Land, Orange County, California, when we started high school. We were both good athletes. Kenny was an incredible athlete. He set the national record for his age in the 2-mile as a freshman, and had scholarship offers of inquiries from Stanford but he got injured, couldn't recover. It was a rough, I started hanging out with some rough crowds, and that was the time that the drugs were starting to hit the scene. I was 3 years older, so I missed that part of it. I mean, I picked it up in college, but it didn't hit the high schools when I was in high school. He dropped out of high school, enlisted in the Army, came back a heroin addict, as so many of the boys did during the Vietnam War.
So he was in Vietnam.
And no, he wasn't. He was too young. He was 17, but
Oh, okay.
when he enlisted. But do you recall the CIA was selling the heroin to fund the war
Oh, yeah.
to American
Yes.
troops. Well, he started robbing banks to fund his heroin habit. He got caught. He pled guilty. He said, I did it. So he does his time. I think he went to prison about 1979, 1980. I think he did 6 years at Lompoc, which was a tough federal prison. He gets out in 1988. He marries his longtime girlfriend, gets to work. He turned his life around. He worked construction, had a probation officer that was a difficult person. Probation officers have so much control, and unrightly so, over the inmates assigned to them. I mean, they're like God Almighty. They can impose any condition they want. They can impose on you their personal beliefs, their personal prejudices. Well, this guy had a thing about drinking, and my brother worked construction, and you can't work construction, to my knowledge, without drinking beer. I mean, that's part of the job. It goes with the job qualification, I think, especially down in Southern California. And
Well, I'm a fan of beer, so I can relate.
well, he imposed a no beer drinking condition.
Okay.
And my brother went into him and said, we fought it. I took it all the way up administratively up to the top, and we lost. So my brother just goes into him and says, look, I'm going to drink beer. You know where I live. If you want to come and get me, come and get me. I'm not coming back and giving you a urine test every 2 weeks to show
Sure.
that I've been drinking beer. Well, nothing happens. Nothing happens. Life goes on until about June 9th, 1995. He was coming back across the border from Baja, California. I think he'd been down to visit his wife's family. His wife's Hispanic, an American citizen. And he was driving. This was very important. I didn't know at the time, but I do now. He was driving a mid-1985, I think it was 1986 Chevrolet pickup truck that belonged to his friend. He was about 5'8", powerful upper body build, dark complected, had been a bank robber, of course, and had a dragon tattoo on his left forearm. He's arrested at the border. He's held there in the federal detention center until August 18th, 1995, when he's suddenly sent to Oklahoma City.
Now, question for you. What was he arrested for at the border?
I'm not so sure. I was never been able to confirm that. I think now, in hindsight, I think that was the largest manhunt going on at that time in America, in American history ever, for John Doe 2.
John Doe number 2 remains at large. He should be considered armed and extremely dangerous.
And they had the FBI had a $2 million award out for his arrest. The description they circulated to John Doe 2 was white male, dark complected, 5'8", 5'9", driving mid-1980s Chevrolet pickup truck, believed to be in Canada or Mexico, dragon tattoo left forearm.
The second man is also medium build. He's further described as 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with brown hair and a tattoo visible on his left arm.
So yeah, he would match. So is it possible, and I'm speculating now, that they had a wanted image or something, and they said, hey, this guy looks like this. Let's run his name. Oh, it turns out he's on parole. We can just violate him very easily and grab him and put him in custody. Do you think Might be something like that.
That could be possible, but then there's a difficulty there too.
Mhm.
They never knew his real name.
Oh,
When he robbed banks under an alias, Vance Paul Brockway. They arrested him as Vance Paul Brockway.
they didn't
They-
take his ID and put it down?
No, his whole time in prison, I would write to him as Vance Paul Brockway. And when he's killed, the medical examiner, I called the medical examiner's office in Oklahoma City. I said, I want to know what happened to my brother, Kenneth Michael Trentadue. He says, we don't have a Kenneth Michael Trentadue here. I said, so you sure as hell do. That's what they tell me. And he said, no, we don't. We have an inmate, but it's Vance Paul Brockway. All of his prison records, all of his court records, the arrest warrant that for the pro violation they put out. They put that out back in 1988. And it's under Vance Paul Brockway. If they'd known his real name, he might be alive today. All they knew was Vance Paul Brockway, bank robber, identical match to John Doe too. As incredible as it may seem, Mr. Hunley, they never knew it was Kenneth Michael Trentadue until I told them.
Well, I'm guessing he did not have an ID on him when he was arrested.
I think he may have. I don't know what he had on him.
Because that just seems ludicrous.
They processed him as Vance Paul Brockway. Never knew his name was Trentadue.
That's fascinating. Now, that's going to come into significance later in the story as well. So I definitely want to put a pin on that and
Yes.
note that the wrong name becomes a big factor. So he was arrested August 18th, 1995, I believe. And he was talking with you, feeling fine, whatever. Hey, we're going to beat this rap. I'm going to get out. Everything was seeming okay, correct?
Yes, and see, he was arrested, as I said, back, I think, June 9th. They called off the hunt for John Doe 2, announced there was no John Doe 2 about 2 weeks later. The FBI did. They transfer him to Oklahoma, and he arrives there on the 18th, and he calls and speaks with my sister, I think my mother. He called me on the 19th from Oklahoma. We were talking about getting ready for his parole revocation hearing, which I now know was a sham. And I'll tell you about that in a second. And we weren't worried. You're going to send somebody back to prison for years for drinking beer?
Right.
You got all these pro violators out there killing people, raping, committing horrible crimes, and you're going to put somebody in jail forever for drinking beer who's lived out on parole all these years, paid the taxes.
I was going to say he's been out for 7 years, right?
Yeah.
So that he was probably coming into the end of his parole at some point anyway.
I would hope so. I don't know. I can't recall right now. It's been so
Okay.
long. But I now know that the parole revocation hearing was a sham. I was not I didn't practice criminal law, but I've since come to learn that he had committed his crime in San Diego. The judge who had sentenced him was in San Diego. His parole officer was in San Diego. Only the judge who sentenced him can revoke his parole. So they could not do anything in Oklahoma. That was a sham. I mean, to get him to Oklahoma, I now realize. But he said, I'm going there for a parole revocation hearing. It never occurred to me to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this picture. I was sure as he'll say it today. But at that time, I did not have a clue. So I talked to him. This was on a Saturday. It was a Saturday the 19th. I said, okay, call me back tomorrow. And we'll start getting ready for the hearing. And that would have been Sunday the 20th. Well, he doesn't call him. And the next we hear is the associate warden calls my mother on the morning of August 21st, Monday, 1995, and says, your son, Vance Paul Brockway, has committed suicide. And my mother said, my son is Kenneth Michael Trentadue. But he was arrested years ago under that name. She said, well, he's committed suicide. We'd like permission to cremate the body. And my mother said, no, you can't do that. Well, I'd since found out that they had already gone to the medical examiner twice, the FBI and BOP, demanding that Kenny be cremated.
Yeah, that seems kind of aggressive for a prisoner that they're, you know, wanting to so rapidly go to cremation. That seems aggressive.
Well, and also since the federal government didn't allow cremation,
I did not know that.
they didn't. They've changed the policy since then, and I say probably because of my brother's case, but they it wasn't allowed then. And so what they do then is they call back and they say, um, we'd like to have an autopsy. And I said, we want one too. And they said, well, you have to give us a power of attorney to get it. Well, I realize now, a power of attorney over the body, and I realize now that it was a sly attempt to get control authority uh, to order the cremation. Because I also found out he'd already had an autopsy.
I see. So they could go have the autopsy and say, okay, autopsy done, cremated body, moving on.
Moving on. And I didn't know that they'd already done the autopsy. And when I found out that he'd been turned over to the medical examiner, that's when he learned, and he was outraged when he learned that the name for the medical examiner, Dr. Jordan, was outraged when he learned that his real name was not Vance Paul Brockway, but Kenneth Michael Trentadue.
I made a lot of people very angry at me, and that's just a shame. Because I am trying to protect the public safety here, and it's just too bad. That's the way it's going to have to be.
Brett Jordan, the state's chief medical examiner, speaks out in anger about the mysterious death of Kenneth Michael Trentadue.
Hi there. I just wanted to take a moment and thank you so much for following this content, and to let you know that a lot of what I'm covering has been influenced by this fantastic book, Blowback, by Margaret Roberts. Now, this book took me on the path to keep investigating the story, which I will be doing over many episodes. If you're interested in the book, there's a link for it in the description. And if you want to keep following this content, please consider subscribing. It really helps a lot. It will help me attract even more guests to get to the bottom of this whole Oklahoma City bombing scenario. Thank you so much.
But there was so much that went on that morning that I did not know at the time.
Sure.
The news of my brother's death was on Janet Reno's desk within 24 hours. Now, you tell me, is the Attorney General of the United States notified of every inmate's death in this country, much less in 24 hours?
Wow. That's remarkable. Now, you found all this out later through your case and suing and subpoenas. You've had to drag all this information out.
Yes, I was totally in the dark about all of this in the beginning. The Department of Justice, I found out later, completed its investigation and declared it a suicide within 2 days of his death.
Okay, now I want to back up a little bit because I definitely don't want to overlook anything. I know they were rushing to move it on, get it off their desk and out of there. You and your mother, I believe, and sister all said he needs to be sent to us.
Yes, we refused the cremation. Send him on. And I'll tell you why. We didn't for a minute believe he'd committed suicide. We knew if he'd been murdered, he'd be beat to shit because he was a tough guy, a good guy. People loved him. He was not a violent guy, but he was one of these people that we cleaned out some bars in our younger days when country and western bars. But
Sure.
I get hit hard enough and you're going to knock the fight right out of me. Kenny was the kind of guy that he was like the Incredible Hulk. The more you hit him, the more enraged he became. So I've seen him fight 2 men at one time. I mean, I knew that if he'd been murdered, if he wasn't a suicide and he'd been murdered, he'd be beat up bad. And there'd be people hurt on the other side too. And so we'd insisted on getting the body home. Well, it took a week.
Now, you thought, I'm just guessing at this point, you weren't thinking officials had anything to do with anything. You were thinking that he got harmed in a prison fight or something like that. Was that what you were imagining?
That was my first thought. You know, that happens. You hear that all the time about the inmates killing inmates. But I knew that it wasn't suicide, and we sure as hell wanted to find out. So that they had we could never get any advance notification of when he was coming home. And I was in Salt Lake, and my mother's sister and his wife lived in Orange County, and that's where they sent his body. And they called me up on a Saturday and said that the body's arrived. We're going to the funeral home. And I said, okay, I'm catching the first flight down. He arrived, and I'm sorry I didn't have photographs of these bodies when it arrived, but my mother and sister and his wife say it was completely made up, so no injuries were revealed.
Right. He's prepared for burial, for an open casket type of
casket. They stripped him. They took all the makeup off, and he was beaten to a pulp. His head he'd received 3 massive blows in the head that had ruptured the skin to the skull. You could see the skull. And these are not just like 1-inch wounds. These are 5 to 6-inch wounds. He had stun gun burns all over his body, even the soles of his feet. His face was beat to a pulp. He had his knuckles were black on both hands. So he'd been in one hell of a fight. He had fingerprint bruises on his biceps where he'd been held and strangled. And his throat was cut.
He has a number of abrasions on his face, around his right eye, and on his forehead.
Dr. Steve Dunton, a medical examiner in the Atlanta area, reviewed the photos and videotape of Trentadue's body for CNN.
This collection of different injuries, bruises, abrasions on different areas of the body, particularly those in the back of his hands, the back of his arm, I find this to be highly suspicious.
They don't appear to be self-inflicted.
Most of these, no. I don't see how they could be.
And Janet Reed on the Department of Justice said, well, this is a suicide. He hanged himself. And it was we insisted on an open casket. And at the funeral, we had several people go out in the parking lot and puke because the wounds were so shocking.
Now, I want to interject right here and let everyone in the audience know that there's a link below to a website, KennethTrentadue.com. And there are photographs and there is video of what was done to Ken that all of you can check out. I cannot put it out on YouTube, or this video will be struck or taken down, or there'll be issues. But it's very important that you know that you can see every bit of damage, everything that we are describing is available at the link in the description, KennethTrentadue.com. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I do want people to know that they can actually see for themselves what damage was done to your brother.
And I appreciate that, because that website, I realized that I may not live to see the end conclusion of this fight. And so what I did was compile 30 years worth of evidence, court filings, photographs, and put it on that website so that sometime in the future, if somebody else wants to pick up this fight, they don't have to replow 30 years worth of ground. They can start right where I stopped. And it's all there. And I think you'll tell your audience it's massive. It's massive. It's got from the day he was murdered till today. I mean, it's there. But the backup important thing is what was going on behind the scenes we didn't know about in the hours after he'd been killed. Federal government requires what they call a psychological reconstruction of an inmate suicide. They have a special team who goes to the prison and analyzes the death to see, one, if it was a suicide, and two, if it was a suicide, how could it have been prevented? Were there things we could have done in terms of how we handle inmates and the treatment of them?
So what do? Do they look at the scene itself and then interview other prisoners to find out how the person was acting, how they were talking to others, stuff like that?
They do, and the most important thing is the scene. They called the FBI and the BOP that morning, the psychological reconstruction team, about 6 in the morning on the 21st, and he supposedly killed himself at 3 in the morning on the 21st, and said, we're on our way. We'll be there this afternoon. The FBI and the BOP immediately ordered the scene cleaned. They sent the inmates in to mop up all the blood, Clorox everything, wipe down.
Hold on, you said a lot of blood. From what I understand, he had hanged himself. That's not typically, doesn't produce a lot of blood.
I've been told that the cell was awash in blood. And in fact, when I finally got to see the crime scene photographs years and years later, because they had disappeared, blood everywhere. And the medical examiner, when he finally was allowed into the cell 4 months afterwards, he used a chemical called luminol, which will show red blood residue under a blue or black light. He said the cell lit up like a Christmas tree. There had been so much blood in there.
Are those crime scene photos also on the site?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Yeah,
So everybody check for yourselves. Don't take our word for it. It's very important. Don't take our word for it. Go look yourself. Go read things yourself, because it gets very deep very quickly. And
it's important to go back to that in the hours immediately afterwards. The medical examiner's investigator shows up about 7 a.m. to retrieve my brother's body. Now, the medical examiner by law has control over the scene and the body. They will not let him into the cell.
Is that Dr. Fred Jordan?
It was Dr. Fred Jordan is a medical examiner, but he sent his investigator out there to get it. And they said, we want to see the scene. You can't. He doesn't get into the scene until, as I think it was December, and that's after it had been sanitized. And there's a lead side note on the wall that says, goodbye, family, or something. Love, Paul. Love from Ilya, Paul, is what I've been told it said. Well, Kenny wouldn't have signed his name Paul if it had been a suicide note.
That is a rather unusual thing. He was so distraught that he forgot his own name.
So Jordan says, I want that note analyzed. He comes back 2 weeks later and they painted it over. And the FBI crime lab says we cannot determine who wrote that note based on the photographs you give us. So they took away the note. My brother had, according to witnesses, he had blood-stained clothing on when he was saturated in blood when the body was found. The clothing disappeared. I asked them what happened to the clothing. They said, we don't know. There's logbooks. The prisons are run with logbooks.
Mm-hmm.
There's, logbook of when they're fed, logbook who's in the cell,
Sure.
logbook who enters the cell. And all of the logbooks involving my brother either disappeared or the pages are missing for the days he's there. And these logbooks are sent when they're completed at the end of the year. They go to the National Archive, just like a ship's log do, a carrier's gone. Videotape camera. They said the camera malfunctioned. Well,
isn't it odd how that happens? You do know that the camera malfunctioned in 2019 at a federal facility, also a special housing unit in another place with an individual named Jeffrey Epstein. They actually had 4 cameras out of 5 for some reason failed that evening. And I think the parallels are striking because your brother was in a special housing unit, I believe.
He was supposedly a suicide-proof cell. Well, the camera gets interesting for 2 reasons. The FBI and the Department of Justice take the camera and the tape. There's only like a second or 2 seconds on the tape. It just goes blank. And to a very famous videographer named Norman Pearl. Pearl was an expert on videotapes. And remember, to your audience, this is 1995. We didn't have the digital technology we have today. It was the old VHS tapes. Pearl examines it, and they said, the FBI told them, we don't want to report. You just call us and tell us what you find. Pearl calls them up and says, the tape's been erased. They show up at his door, take the camera back, take the tape back, tell him to keep his mouth shut, and they go on and give it to a retired FBI video expert, supposedly, who says the camera had malfunctioned. But anyway, Pearl is so upset by this, and Pearl had been the videographer in the Rodney King trial. I mean, he was a heavyweight. He calls me up before the trial and says, and he told me what happened, and he says, I'm coming to testify for you. Boy, I thought, this is home run. Well, he doesn't show up because they found him dead in a motel room in Morro Bay, California. And what I heard, at least read, all I could read was the medical examiner says of unknown causes. And this is a guy who's in his 40s, I think. But he wasn't first of the witnesses. I've lost a lot of witnesses through.
Yeah, can we go into that? Because from what I understand, you got a phone call from someone who tipped you off saying that he was beaten by authorities in the cell.
Yes. And again, for your audience, this call came in, it's been over 30 years, December of 95 or January 96. And in those days, I'm not even sure we had the cell phones. I think were the size of bricks or something like that.
Oh, I remember.
And
Carried them in a suitcase. Everybody who watches the movie Wall Street should be familiar with it.
And there was no caller ID. And so you don't know who to call. And the call came in, and it was a man, and he says, I want you to know about your brother. And I said, okay. I took all calls because you never know when, 99% of them are bullshit, but you never know which one is going to be the one you need. And the caller said, I want you to know that your brother was killed by the FBI. It was an interrogation that went wrong. He was suspected of being a member of a bank robbery gang who were using the proceeds of the robberies to fund a war against the federal government. Okay. And I put that away in the back of my head and I said, yeah, right. And then June or July of 96, I read a Los Angeles Times article about a man named Richard Lee Guthrie, who had been a member of what was called the Aryan Republican Army, or ARA. They were bank robbers in the Midwest who were robbing banks with Tim McVeigh to use the proceeds, in armored cars, to use the proceeds to fund the war against the federal government. I go, well, that's interesting. But they never had a picture of Guthrie. Never had a picture of Guthrie.
Mm-hmm.
Once years later, when I saw Guthrie's picture, I go, he sure looks a lot like my brother. Well, this story was about the fact that Guthrie had, in federal custody, committed suicide by hanging himself. And ironically, according to the LA Times, he did so the day before he was going to give a tell-all interview to a reporter from the Times that says, he said it would blow the lid off the Oklahoma City bombing. This was June or July. And then August, the FBI and lawyers from Maine Justice in D.C., and my fight with the federal government, they don't use the local U.S. attorneys, the women and men who represent your state. They always bring in these special crews from Washington. And I found most of the local U.S. attorneys, men and women, to be honorable people. Can't say the same thing about the people coming in from Maine Justice in D.C., but anyway, they show up. And I remember vividly, and I told them about that call in December, and I told them about Guthrie, and you could see the look on their face, shock, and they're taking vigorous notes, the FBI is. And years later, once I realized that my brother's death was linked to the bombing, I did a FOIA request for those notes to show that in 1996, I had told them about the ARA connection. And they come back and they say, well, there are no notes. And the judge didn't believe them. He said, they prepare a report that's called a 302.
Yeah.
So every time they have a bowel movement, they write a 302.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you fly all the way out here from DC and you do no report.
So you had no 302 on you when you were talking to them?
No notes, not even the notes.
Very interesting.
On the interview. And I think years ago, I filed a FOIA request for my records, and I said he didn't have it. But just before he was executed, McVeigh got a hold of me, sent me a message, and he said, when I saw your brother's picture and what I'd done to him, and I want you to know that I believe the FBI killed him because they thought he was Richard Lee Guthrie. And now I'm starting.
How did he get a hold of you? Did he call you directly?
Well, he sent a message to another inmate that was on death row with him, who I'd befriended and helped legally on some legal matters.
Mr. Hammer?
Yep. He sent it out to me as legal mail. And then it all came together. Meanwhile, we'd had the trial in 2000. We won the case. The judge didn't find murder. We found intentional infliction of emotional distress, and awarded us $1.1 million. And
that verdict is always just seems like an odd ruling. And, maybe you can explain that one more, because, Do you feel like that was kind of a gift to you to try to shut you up and make you go away?
You know,
And give you
they thought we were interested in the money. That's all we wanted. All they did was make us armed and dangerous.
Mhm.
We used that money to pay our legal bills. Most of it went to there, and we made sure that my brother's widow and baby, his son was 2 months old when he was killed, were taken care of. And then we put up a $250,000 reward. And that was a litmus test. If the guards had killed him, they'd sell their mother's eyes for a nickel. Somebody would claim that reward. But nobody does. Nobody comes forward. And that tells me the reason you're not claiming that reward is because there are people higher up, way higher up, that you're afraid of, and you're not going to say anything.
There's a cost
about it. So like putting on a reward for a mafia killer. Good luck there. But I said it finally came together in 2003, and because we never, I said at the trial, we never had a motive. People would say, why would the government of the United States torture and murder your brother and did not do anything about it, cover it up? And I had no explanation. Could not fathom why that would happen. Now I know it was to conceal a bigger, uglier picture involving the DOJ and the FBI. But back to what the final event was, a reporter named J.D. Cash. J.D. did some amazing work on the bombing. He was a hunting and fishing reporter in the McCurtain County Daily in eastern Oklahoma. He'd had family and friends killed in the bombing and injured. He started right away investigating it.
One witness has McVeigh with 3 or 4 people. So what's going on? Who are these other men? And obviously, if there's more out there, they need to be caught too.
So JD calls me up and he introduced himself and he says, can I talk to you about your brother? I says, yes. He says, how tall was he? And I said, about 5'8", 5'9". He said, what was his build like? I said, he's powerfully built. And I said, JD said, what was his complexion like? I said, he's dark. JD said, well, where was he arrested? I said, coming across the border from Mexico, having visited family. JD says, what was he driving? I said, mid-1980s, 1986 Chevrolet pickup truck. JD says, you have any tattoos? I go, yeah. JD said, what kind and where? I said, he had a dragon tattoo on his left forearm. JD said, oh, shit. Are you sitting down? He said, you better sit down. I said, I am sitting down. He said, well, let me give you this information. At the time your brother was murdered, the FBI was been all points bulletin, $2 million reward for John Doe 2, dark complected, 5'9", 5'8", 5'9", powerful upper body build, believed to be in Canada or Mexico, driving mid-1980s Chevrolet pickup truck, dragon tattoo, left forearm. JD said, they killed your brother because they thought he was John Doe 2. And that's what started my FOIA fights right there.
That is insane. And you heard from J.D. Cash, like in what, 2000, 2001? 2003. Okay, several years down the road. Now, I want to back up, though, because there's a lot I feel like we kind of blew by to get to your verdict.
I think the murders are important.
Yes. Starting with that, you had Nick and Acabaso. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Acabaso, yes.
Acabaso,
Young kid.
yeah.
I think he's been in prison. I can't remember what he's in for. And then Alden Gillis Baker. Both had heard of my brother's murder, torture. Acabaso dies before the trial of a drug overdose, supposedly. Alden Gillis Baker was in Lompoc. He before the trial, he had been threatened. The Department of Justice had recruited 3 inmates to tune him up to get him to change his testimony. He refused. He called the U.S. Attorney's Office back in D.C., said, you got to stop this. And the U.S. Attorney said to him, well, you going to change your testimony? And Baker says, no. He said, then I'm not going to help you. So I go to the judge and I ask for a protective order for Baker. So they want to kill him. The judge sets on the order. About a month before trial, they find Baker hanging his cells in Lompoc, and the judge denies the protective order is moot because Baker's dead.
Mm. Okay, and this goes even further. You and I'm not trying to blow by their deaths. This is very creepy stuff. So then Fred Jordan, the medical examiner, is very concerned, and we are inserting a clip here of him discussing the case.
Do you believe he was murdered?
I think it's very likely he was murdered. I'm not able to prove it. I have temporarily classified the death as undetermined. You see a body covered with blood, removed from the room, as Mr. Trentadue was, soaked in blood, covered with bruises. And you try to gain access to the scene, and the government of the United States says, no, you can't. They continued to prohibit us from having access to the scene of his death, which is unheard of in 1997, until about 5 months later. We went in there and luminoled, and it lit up like a candle because of the blood still present on the walls of the room after 4 or 5 months. But at that point, we have no scene. We have no crime scene. So there are questions about the death of Kenneth Trentadue that will never be answered because of the actions of the United States government.
But Fred Jordan found your brother's death to be very suspect, and I believe was going to testify for you, but some things went awry.
Well, they were on him like a chicken on a June bug. They, meaning the Department of Justice and FBI, harassing him. The harassment reached a point where a Deputy Attorney General, Patrick Crawley, wrote to the Department of Justice. I think he even wrote to Janet Reno and said, pull off. Quit threatening Dr. Jordan, quit harassing Dr. Jordan. Jordan himself told me that it reached the point, and I've seen this, he wrote to the IRS and wanted a protective audit. He says, I think you're going to try to prosecute me. And he told me that when he had to travel around the state to different crime scenes, he had such fear of the FBI that he always took a pistol with him. And Jordan said, I'll never be able to figure out what happened here because they destroyed a crime scene. He said, it's unheard of. I was in control of the crime scene. They tell me I can't come in. There's a great line he puts in there. He says, this was either botched or intended by the federal government. And years later, he refused. I mean, he stood so firm for years, would not declare suicide. And then suddenly he called me one day and he says, well, you have 15 minutes to convince me that your brother's death was not a suicide. And I said, well, Dr. Jordan, you know, they won't give us access to the evidence. They didn't give you access to the evidence. We've sued them. I'm going to get you the evidence in this lawsuit. And he said, basically, that's not good enough. He went in and changed the manner of death to suicide. I spoke later with some of his staff who told me that before we made that change, several FBI agents came, took him out of the office, brought him back several hours later. He was white as a sheet, went in and changed it, manner of death to suicide.
And I'm guessing you never had any contact with him after that point?
No, but well, what I did, I had to appear and he was deposed in a defamation suit. After he spent his whole career in Oklahoma. The minute he retires, he leaves Oklahoma and goes to Maine. He's deposed. At that time, he said, my brother had been beaten. And then he looked at the ligature mark on his neck and he says, it's highly likely he was strangled with a plastic handcuff because you could see the cross tie impressions. It's a mechanical tie. You could see where they had strangled him as they were holding with a mechanical. He said that, but by then it's too late. The trial's over, the grand jury's over. Everything came too late.
While we're on that, part of the reason he was having problems himself and you were having problems is, from what I understand, you had a group, a Trentadue mission led by this guy, a Deputy Attorney General by the name of Eric Holder, who was trying to manage the story. Can you talk about that?
Yes, he was Deputy Attorney General. The Attorney General's office, urine is all over this case. Reno, Holder, Jamie Gorlick, but Holder was assigned. They put together what they called the Trentadue mission, and it was to cover it up. And they were terrified that the Senate Judiciary was going to hold hearings. And so they were on the two most powerful senators there at the time, Orrin Hatch and Byron Dorgan. Orrin Hatch from Salt Lake City, Utah, who was my senator, and Byron Dorgan from North Dakota. And they had this list of Trenadues means things to do, and Trenadon'ts meaning things not to do. And when you look at the people on that mission, you have Julietta Kayyem, you have Elaine Meyer, you have some of the heavy hitters in the Clinton administration devoting all, and Eric Holder was the captain of it. He made a comment that it was like coordinating the Battle of Normandy in order to kill all of this stuff that's going on that might expose them.
Now, you have this in emails or notes that you've managed to pull out of subpoena?
Yes, they're in the website.
Okay,
I put them in the record before Congress when they were going to nominate Holder as the Attorney General under President Obama. I said, this man that is not to serve Attorney General, look what the hell he did in my brother's case. And so that's part of the congressional record as part of that website. But the Attorney General's office gets even uglier. It's in the spring. It was Holder's predecessor was Jamie Gorelick, and she's the one, and now it makes perfect sense. She was the one overseeing the bombing prosecution. She calls together a meeting back in Main Justice. This was March, I think, of 97. The grand jury had been convened, and there's a story about all we have to do to get the grand jury, but I'll tell that later. But in July of 96, March of 97, she convenes this meeting with Main Justice lawyers out of D.C., from the torch branch, meaning people who are going to defend the government if we sue them, and the prosecuting branch that was handling the grand jury. And they're sitting down in a room and they're talking about how to conduct the grand jury, basically to bring it to a no bill. Don't indict anybody. Don't do it. And this is incredible.
Which is, it is rare. Now, I know you're not a criminal lawyer, but I do hang out with several lawyers and do shows. There's an old saying that you can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. It is so easy to get an indictment. So the idea of trying to not get one does seem counterintuitive.
Oh, well, plus I tried to get those notes of those meetings. They marked it as work product, meaning they were preparing for a civil suit, and we hadn't even sued them. So they were going to orchestrate the grand jury to come in with a no bill. But your thing about the ham sandwich is exactly right. A prosecutor's role in a grand jury is to convince the grand juries there was a crime. You don't put on exculpatory evidence. I found out that they reached out, the Department of Justice lawyers, to Dr. Gormley, who was the chief pathologist for the military. He was the head of all the pathology autopsies done by military people, begging him to come to Oklahoma City to say that my brother's death was a suicide. Gormley refused. In fact, he tells us this is actually a murder, and there's no way in hell I'm going to go to Oklahoma and tell him that this was a suicide. But the fact that the prosecutors are bringing in exculpatory evidence, but it gets even worse, because one of the things I found out is they had a plan to indict me. They tried 3 times, but they were going to do it, they thought, to the grand jury. And what they said is, we can't tell him he's a target, because then he won't come to the grand jury. So what we're going to do is invite him to the grand jury to testify. And there we'll try to lay a trap for him so we can indict him. And that's all. I'm not pulling this out of my rear end. This is all documented. I think most of it's in that website too. But the whole purpose of the grand jury was to indict me.
For what?
Obstruction of justice.
Okay, I want to go over this a little bit so people understand it, because it is sort of, it's bonkers if you really look at the situation. You have a prosecutor. Now, a prosecutor, their whole mission in life is to put people behind bars or prosecute them. They are running defense with the grand jury instead of prosecuting, which is a very odd situation.
Well, it gets even uglier. They brought in an inmate who claimed that he was my brother's best friend and my brother was gay and he killed himself because he was sent back to prison. The guy had failed a polygraph exam They knew it, and they still put him on the. My brother didn't. We never heard of this guy before. One of the more outrageous ones. The Saturday before I spoke with my brother, he'd called my home and I wasn't here, and he's talked to my wife. And she said, "Where are you, Ken?" He says, "Oklahoma." And my wife said, "How did you get to Oklahoma?" He said, "It's that jet." He said, "It's that jet age thing." And she says, "What do you mean?" He says, "They fly inmates now around the country by jets to different institutions. They take that transcript's transcribed. I got the original. It's jet age. They take that transcript and change jet age to AIDS, and then give it to the grand jury and tell them he killed himself because he had AIDS. And then they go ahead and release it to the press and tell them that he killed himself because he had AIDS." And press releases were coming all the time. The first press release came within a week of my brother's murder, and they said it was a suicide in the story.
Now, just to address why they even went to a grand jury at all, because one would think if you don't want something to happen, you would never even bring it to the grand jury. Is it the case that it only went to the grand jury because you had a friend in Senator Orrin Hatch who was demanding that the Justice Department do something?
That's partially true, but it starts months earlier.
Okay.
We couldn't understand. I thought this would be over. Once we saw my brother's body, and I went to Oklahoma and met with the FBI and showed them the photographs. And that's when immediately they released a press release saying suicide. That was like September, first week of September, 95. Well, we were rolling into weeks and months and nothing. And, the official story from the Department of Justice in Reno is suicide by hanging. Well, we went and contacted, you've seen bus stops where they have the ads?
Yeah, sure.
Well, we went and contacted the bus stop ad people and said, "Would you put these ads up?" And pictures of my brother, body, brutalized. And I said, "What will it cost us?" He said, "It won't cost you a nickel. You provide the ads and we'll post them." And so we posted them around Orange County, and a lot of citizens in the little communities complained. He says, "It's sickening to see this, what was done to this man. We'd like him taken down." And to their credit, the city councils and all those communities said, "No, this is too important." And so we're starting to generate publicity. And then CNN steps up in the fall of 95 and does an 8-minute piece on my brother's murder.
Well, every day in America, the FBI investigates allegations of corrections officials abusing inmates. Sometimes the accusations even include murder. Today, we'll look at one such case in Oklahoma City. To friends and family, Kenneth Trentadue was a kind man.
And then we start, and the press is jumping on it now, and we're seeing more. I mean, NBC Dateline did a series. I mean, so they're getting pounded with the press. And so finally Hatch calls them in the Senate Judiciary meeting and tells Janet Reno, "This man has been murdered. I want a grand jury." And that's how it came about.
Another hero for that, I forgot her name. Wasn't there a New Yorker or a GQ writer?
Oh, yes, Mary. God bless Mary Fisher. Mary Fisher was the very first one.
Okay.
She did an incredible story on my brother's murder. The very first one, it was like, on everything on the website on information is chronological. She's number one. It ended up getting her fired.
Wow.
From GQ. And that happens to a lot of people who report on this. But important thing about the media, they were very supportive as long as they thought he'd been killed by guards. Once, I never started out to solve the Oklahoma City bombing, but the trail went to Oklahoma eventually. Once that trail went to Oklahoma, the media went silent. No talk about it. In fact, they would come and ask to see the evidence I'd massed to show the FBI's involvement in the bombing of my brother's murder, and do nothing. The only entity that did something was the BBC. They sent a crew over here and spent a month, I think, filmed it about, the FBI is all over this bombing and Kenny's murder. That aired all over Europe. Not once did it air in the United States, that BBC show. And I found out later that, I now know why, it's because the FBI, and we'll talk about this in some future program, had an sensitive informant program where they put informers, obtained informants at the highest level of the media management. And their job was to kill stories that were harmful to the FBI, or at least tame them down, or in case of an anonymous person who came forward with a new story, to tell the FBI who it was about the bombing or my brother's murder. So the mainstream media left, and I have it's not such a funny story, but in the way it is, I was contacted by a reporter from one of the major networks. He wanted to see everything, and I showed it to him. I handed it out to everybody, as you can tell from the website. I mean, I wanted.
No, it's thorough. It's very thorough.
And a while later, he comes back and he says, this story will win you a Pulitzer or get you killed. And that was the last I heard from him.
You did have some real journalists, though, who were tackling the case, like J.D. Cash, I believe, Roger Charles.
Yes.
Even there's kind of a funny story with Roger Charles, and this is leading into the next part, which we're not covering. We're teasing a little bit here, but Roger Charles is a descendant of another family who was actually an enemy of your family. Many people have heard of a very famous dispute between the Hatfields and the McCoys. And I believe you go back to the Hatfields, correct?
Yes, Roger. I'm from Matandale County, and that's the poorest county in West Virginia. Roger's from Mingo County, which is next door, which is the second poorest. And I think West Virginia is a poor state. It's a poor state in Appalachian. It's more like second or third, if that's an honor in the country. But his family were McCoys, and my family were Hatfields. And when we were born, they were still shooting each other. And we were former Marines. And he became a wonderful friend. We lost Roger a couple of years ago, but incredibly bright man. He and J.D. Cash did some yeoman's work in bringing out the bombing story. And there's, about the media, there's two interesting stories about that too, is they had put together a story with ABC News that was going to expose the FBI had prior knowledge. Roger's sitting down in front of the television waiting for it to air, and it doesn't. He finds out later that it had been killed by ABC. As it turns out, we discovered years later that the second command of ABC News was one of the FBI's informants.
When you kind of wonder too, I mean, who is one of the head anchors or columnists on ABC now? A certain gentleman named George Stephanopoulos. And who did he work for very famously in the 90s? A certain President Bill Clinton. And a lot of this, maybe not directly, but it does seem to wind its way back to Arkansas as well. This entire nest of issues. And this whole story is so sprawling that I'm literally taking it in chunks to try to digest it as much as possible. I mean, there's a joke, how do you eat a Buick? You grind it down and then you take a spoonful at a time, and eventually you can consume the whole thing. That's what this story is going to be.
And to follow up on that, there's one other, and I realize you'll come up later with this, and this is just to give you an overall view of it. We'll get to a fellow named John Matthews, who had been undercover for the FBI for a decade in the 90s in a program called PATCON, or Patriot Conspiracy. PATCON was an acronym for it. And the objective of PATCON was to infiltrate and incite militia groups to violence, Matthews said. Matthews comes out of the cold to me and tells me the story. He said, Waco was a PATCON operation, Ruby Ridge PATCON operation, the Lone Wolf gun store, Fast and Furious, was a PATCON operation. They even had a plan in place to blow up the cooling system or damage the cooling system at the Browns Ferry nuclear plant in Alabama, which would have been another Fukushima. They were selling Stinger missiles, that had a program to do that, anti-aircraft missiles. And he says, I want this. He says, I want this story told. And I said, John, I said, nobody's going to listen to me, but I had connections with Newsweek. And so I linked John up with the reporters at Newsweek. They just go crazy about the story. They say they'd spent months confirming everything Matthews says. I get a call late November 2011. The story is supposed to air or hit the streets the last Monday of November 2011. So I get a call from the reporter who'd written it. He wouldn't give me a copy of the story. He read it to me. It had everything. It had Matthews, had PatCon, had Waco, Ruby's. And Matthews said also, I believe Oklahoma City was a PatCon operation. But I wasn't there. But I find out later that John wasn't being completely forthright when he said he had no knowledge about it. But that'll be a subject of a later discussion. But anyway, I'm not accusing Matthews of lying. I'm just saying he was very guarded in the early days.
With as many people who have turned up deceased, you might be a little guarded as well.
Well, we found out later he had good reason to be. But anyway, the story comes out on Monday and there's no mention of PatCon. No mention of Waco. No mention of Ruby Ridge. No mention of Brown's Ferry, Lone Wolf Gun Store. Matthew's furious. He says, all they've done is draw a big bullseye on me. He said, they outed me to some very nasty people who are still out there and put my picture on the cover just to remind them what I look like. And he said, then they didn't, and I was willing to take that risk as long as they told the story I wanted told. They didn't do that. They just got me killed. And that what led him to volunteer to testify in the trial I had later on.
Now, on that note, that Newsweek story is very important. And John Matthews wasn't the only one who's upset. I believe Roger Charles was also so upset that he got a hold of a copy of the story and he leaked the story. And we do have that story available that we will be discussing later on, the uncut version of the story, which is in fact online. And
you brought up a point, and I want to mention it so I don't forget it. The people say, how in the hell can you fight the Department of Justice? They're so big in the FBI and downright evil. And I had some advantages there. One, there were people on the inside who were on my side, and I'd get leaked things. Like Roger got leaked that story. I got leaked sealed transcripts. I got leaked FBI memos. Don't know where they came from. They just show up. And those were tremendously valuable to me. The other advantage I had is I knew the FBI will always lie. It will lie even when the truth will serve it better. And knowing that, I could set them up. I would keep what I had been leaked. I would ask for these documents. They would say they don't exist, and then I would throw them down in front of the judge. And I knew that they'd come back and say, those are forgeries. And I had prepared affidavits from FBI personnel on the main justice who had retired and said, no,
can we back up? Because this is the story I wanted to close on, because I feel like this leads into the next part, which was you were frustrated in trying to get an answer about your brother, and they gave you a settlement. Now, I feel like we short shrifted that story because they didn't just say, oh, okay, you won and cut you a check. They appealed it, didn't they? Multiple times?
Oh, multiple. They swore they never pay it. They swore they never pay. I think there were 3 appeals.
Okay.
And you know, they moved the witnesses all over the country to make it as expensive as possible to find them. And I know it's disjointed, but that triggers something on the line now is Alden Gillis Baker. Baker finally reached out to me years after my brother's murder, and he said immediately after the murder, they'd put him on psychotropic medication and what they call diesel therapies, where they move him from institution to institution every 2 or 3 weeks. And it was when they took him off his meds 2 or 3 years later, he snapped out of it and called me and said, I'll be there to testify for you. That's what happened. But they had deliberately moved him, disabled him mentally, and eventually killed him because he was going to testify.
That is so horrible. That is so horrible. Now, because you were stymied in every direction and you're just trying to get an answer. I think you've given up on the idea of actually getting somebody prosecuted for killing your brother directly, but you decided to go after the story and started suing over FOIA. And that leads into one particular story, which you're starting to describe, that I really enjoy. And Roger Charles called it some of that, quote, Hatfield cunning, that you, as you said earlier, you said you knew that the FBI would lie if they ever got an opportunity, or the Department of Justice, I guess would be technically be correct, would lie given the opportunity. But you had a couple memos on hand and you did the same routine. I don't know if you've recalled, just before my time, but the U-2 that was shot down over the Soviet Union, how the Soviet Union handled that story when they said, you know, the U.S. is spying on us. And of course, the U.S. denied it. No, we're not spying on you. And they said, well, we have, like it was some wreckage or something. And they turned it out. It's like, oh, well, no, you didn't do that. It's like, well, you know what? We had the pilot who was flying the plane. And they deliberately rolled it out. And that's kind of what you did, from what I understand, to get the FOIA into action. So can you tell us that story?
Yes. Once it dawned on me after my call with J.D. Cash, and I realized that McVeigh was linked to the Aryan Republican Army, which we'll talk about later, was an FBI front, and to a place called Elham City in Oklahoma. And they had informants there. Then I'd been leaked 2 documents talking about the FBI's informants. And so I filed a FOIA request asking for all documents linking McVeigh and the ARA to Elham City, and then informant documents. And of course, they come back and they say, we don't have any. So I sue them. They tell the judge, we don't have any. So I plop these 2 down in front of the judge. And he looks up at them, and I come back and I say, well, he says, what do you have to say about this? And I say, well, those are forgeries. Then I lay down the affidavit, and the judge goes ballistic, and he says, I want all informant documents. Now, this is interesting. You know, the earliest date on the informant documents is 2 days after the bombing. No documents dealing with informants prior to Oklahoma City bombing. Even though I found out later they had informants that had actually gone with McVeigh and the other perpetrators to scout the target in October '94. So they come back and lie to the judge and say, well, there's nothing before April 20th, 1995, which was a lie. But as they said, they lie all the time. They lie even when truth would serve them better.
It's amazing. And that leads us up that next time we will be talking probably a combination of FOIA and Elham City. I think that location, there's so much to cover there. Like, one, there seemed to be an informant or snitch with every government organization available. You had the head of the ARA, who was a Secret Service informant. You had a gentleman, Andreas Strassmeyer, who we don't know who he really worked for, but it seemed to be the Germans, maybe the U.S. Army, some CIA ties, don't really know on that. You had Carol Howe, because ATF had to get into the action there. So Elham City seemed to be a nest of white supremacists and federal agents, and I'm not sure which was a bigger mess. So that is going to be coming up. And Jesse, thank you so much for getting us started down this path.
As they said, I appreciate the opportunity.